Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to now start our meeting. This is a seventh working group on voluntary efforts and continuous improvement on nuclear safety. And I would like to thank all of you for participating this morning despite your very busy schedules. This is a working group which is to be concluded by 12 o'clock noon. So we have 2.5 hours. We have distributed to you some documents, and I would like to confirm the handout materials and also the attendance of the members. There is a list of documents, agenda, and also the list of participants as well as the documents themselves. Document 1, it is the first meeting in 2014. So we have provided you with the summary of discussions so far and the directions of future discussions. And then we have 3 handout materials related to the presentation by Mr. Pietrangelo. And also there was a document submitted by Toshiba, which also is included here. And also from Mr. Sekimura. We have all the members of the committee present here, and we have with us as presenter from United States, the Senior Vice President of NEI, Mr. Pietrangelo, who will be making a presentation for us. And I would like to thank you very much for coming all the way from the United States. And Exhibit 2-2. Is the personal history of Mr. Pietrangelo. If I may, I'd like to just to give you an outline. Mr. Pietrangelo has an experience over 33 years in the nuclear industry and has worked for Westinghouse, engaged in the construction design startup of operation, and also he has joined the predecessor organization of NEI since 1989. And he's been engaged in technical discussion as well as regulatory aspects. He has been responsible for various aspects of NEI activities, and he'll be talking about how NEI has been contributing to the enhancement of safety in the nuclear industry and all the other activities at NEI. And we have simultaneous interpretation services available. You have the receivers on your tables. Channel 1 is for Japanese, and channel 2 is for English. And if you're leaving this room, please make sure that you leave these receivers on the table. Thank you very much. Thank you. So as for the agenda items this morning, as you look at the agenda, you can see that first of all, we will be talking about the discussion so far and the directions of future discussions, which we discussed in the December meeting. And we had a thorough discussion about the past and the future. So I'd like to ask the Secretariat to briefly talk about it. Yes, you have given us your opinions, and we have made some amendments to the document. So let me just highlight what has been changed. As for the summary of the past discussions so far, so 1-1, that is the desirable attitude towards voluntary safety improvement. And we have included your opinions here. So for voluntary safety improvement, it should be quantitative risk assessment is necessary, but that's only a part of the picture. And so the desirable situation would have to be clearly laid out at the beginning, and then talk about the specific measures to achieve these ideals. That was what was pointed out in the December meeting. So first page towards the second page, we have reflected your opinions into the document. And then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, there are some additional information and some revisions made, but the basic direction has not been changed. And then after page 7 in the English document, the future direction, that in the overview, page 7, a latter part of page 7, at the 1F of typical, the lessons have been learned, and there has been the government and diet investigation committees, which also provided suggestions as to enhance safety, and that should be the starting point for developing specific improvement and enhancement measures. So those are some of the additions to the overview portion. And then in the following page, page 8, based on that, there should be wide encompassing measures, and also, and it says, there's a paragraph on page 8, the value and attitude of organization will be blah, blah, blah. There has to be the PRAs and the other risk assessments should clearly lead to safety enhancement, and the utilities also should engage in risk management so that the safety measures would be directly linked with these the measures, specific measures taken at the nuclear power stations. But as was mentioned by one of the committee members, there should be a virtuous cycle, and the organizational value and attitude, and critical thinking or challenging attitude, and the imagination towards residual risks. Those are the basics, foundations of the organization that should be improved. And without such attitude of the organization, then it will not be possible to take effective measures. And that is also included in this document. So then, specifically, what are the challenges that needs to be addressed going forward? And we should not be just listing up all the things that we should be done. So I have added that line, meaning that in the past discussions, there was much emphasis on the top management commitment by the top management of utilities, and risk management should be endorsed by the top management. And as a starting point of risk management, a quantitative risk assessment would have to be implemented. So on page 9, it talks about how confidence can be recovered from the general public, because otherwise risk-informed public relations activities would not be cannot be implemented. And then in the very last paragraph on page 9 of the English version, these activities would have to be taking root in the nuclear industry in Japan, and in the US there is NEI, IMPO, and EPRI. Those are the framework that provides the basis, and this kind of a new structure would have to be in place in order for these concepts to take root. So starting 2014, we are going to listen to other examples. So this morning we have Mr. Pietandrel with us, and we want to fully understand what the philosophy has been in other countries, including the United States. So based on that understanding, as stated on page 10, we have put together the directions of individual issues. For example, number 1 on page 10, there has to be voluntary and safety improvement activities that should be performed extensively, and widely, and continuously. So that's an addition. And then in page 13, or 6 and 7, the R&D and the risk governance framework, how that can be taken root in Japan, instilled in the Japanese environment. This is something that we need to further discuss and think about in depth. So that was just the major points of a revised document. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we would like to go to the main agenda. We will have 2 speakers. The first speaker will be speaking about the mechanism which is necessary for continuous improvement of nuclear safety. Mr. Tony Pietrangelo, he will be speaking about the programs which are implemented at NEI of the United States, followed by a question and answer session. And the second speaker is Mr. Naoto Sekimura. He will be talking about the safety programs. Mr. Pietrangelo will be speaking for about 50 minutes for his presentation, followed by 45 minutes of discussion, Q&A.
Thank you very much. I'll try to talk for 45 minutes, but really I'm much more interested in having a dialogue with the committee and to try to get after your specific questions about NEI and what we do in the U.S. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here very much. Thank you to Mehdi for the invitation. I've prepared some slides again to cover some of the areas that I was asked to cover from your previous meetings. But I'll go through those slowly, and then hopefully we'll have ample time to discuss your questions, and then I can provide some answers on behalf of what we do in the States. So let me go to slide 2, please. These are the topics that I will cover this morning. First is the relationship that my organization, the Nuclear Energy Institute, has with our regulator in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It is a complicated relationship. We have many issues that we interact on. There's a dynamic between the industry, our regulator, as well as the Congress, which has oversight responsibility for the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So it's an interesting dynamic that provides checks and balances on how our industry is regulated in the United States. I'll also discuss the relationship we have with our members. NEI is made up of about 350 members. Our principal members are the utilities that own and operate nuclear energy facilities in the United States. We also have the 3 principal reactor vendors, Westinghouse, GE Hitachi, and Areva, as principal members, and then what I'll call the rest of the supply side of the industry, engineering contractors, smaller firms, universities, international membership as well. But mainly I'll talk about the relationship between the utilities and our reactor vendors. NEI has done some work with regard to safety culture in the United States. That'll be the third topic. That was an issue after an event in the United States that I'll go into some detail on, that there was a potential for a stronger regulatory presence on safety culture. And this is an area where, as an industry, we did not think that that was the right topic for regulation. And in lieu of regulation, we took an industry initiative, which I'll use it as an example to discuss what we did and why we did that. NEI has been, I think, at the forefront of efforts to use probabilistic risk assessment in regulation as well as in other areas within the utilities. So I'll talk about some of our efforts there to provide leadership to the industry in that regard, and how we support applications of the insights from probabilistic risk assessment going forward. We have an extensive effort to build public confidence at NEI, a big we call it our communications division, that's responsible for public relations, media interactions, and many other activities. And I'll discuss some of the things we have done to help build public confidence. And finally, I'll talk about some specific regulations that this group has discussed, and I think you have in your handout some information on actions the U.S. took on specific issues like station blackout and anticipated transient without scrams, the post 9/11 aircraft impact, and I think there's one other in there that we'll discuss. And then hopefully we'll have ample time to get to your questions and have some good discussion. Okay, can we go to slide 3, please? Let me just check with my interpreters back there. Am I going too fast, or is that okay? Good? Thank you. Okay, slow down a little. I'm Italian. We're used to talking very quickly, so I'll have to do my best to slow down. Okay. First, NEI's relationship with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. A little bit of a history lesson. Before NEI and even some other industry organizations were formed in Washington, there was an Atomic Industrial Forum that served as the industry's principal policy organization and advocacy organization in Washington. So they had been around from the 1950s onward. That group was split up in the 80s into 3 different industry trade associations. One of them was the Nuclear Management and Resources Council that was formed in 1988. I joined that organization in 1989, 1 year after it was formed. And that organization was formed to address technical and regulatory issues on behalf of the industry. But there were 2 other organizations that were also formed. One was the U.S. Council for Energy Awareness. That organization had responsibility for public relations and communications on behalf of the industry. And the third organization was the American Nuclear Energy Council. And they were the government affairs organization for the industry that lobbied with Congress and the administration. Let me talk a little bit more about the organization I worked for, Newmark. Again, that was formed in '88, really to provide a single point of contact for the industry with our regulator, the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Our mission was to provide a unified industry position for the industry on issues that affected all the plants. So we call those generic technical or regulatory issues that are applicable to all the plants. So the idea behind Newmark was to solve the issue one time, leveraging the expertise of our membership, the utilities and the vendors and the suppliers, to come up with a solution and represent that solution to our regulator to try to get endorsement. We had an initiative process that I'll talk about later. There was a permanent management team put in place for Newmark of about 50 people. That the organization grew from about a dozen in '88 to 50 by 1990. Again, the purpose was to provide a professional management team, not an ad hoc team, but permanent managers that could interface with the NRC, develop relationships with the personnel at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to build trust with the regulator on behalf of the industry and to help solve issues appropriately and resolve them in a quick and efficient manner. Let's go to slide 4, please. Trust is a hard thing to establish. It takes years and decades sometimes to establish trust and confidence in the relationship we have with our regulators. But it can be lost very, very quickly. It only takes one bad mistake to undermine trust and confidence. So one aspect of establishing a good relationship with the NRC was that they knew, the regulator knew, that we had the full support of the industry. Every one of the operating companies for our nuclear power plant was a member, and they were committed to NEI by their membership in our organization. As I said earlier, we really try to help our regulator by providing a single point of contact. So if there was an issue that was affecting all the plants, they didn't have to go out to 100 different places or 100 different units to get industry response. We could provide that response on behalf of the industry, and they knew that we had a process to canvassed the industry to get the different perspectives on the issue. So it was really a much more efficient way to interact with our regulator. Let me talk a little bit about what we call our formal industry initiatives. And this is a process that we ask the chief nuclear officers of the operating companies to vote on a given issue. And it's very simple. If there's a proposal to do something, and usually the proposal has to deal with an allocation of resources on behalf of each of the companies, that you need the chief nuclear officer to vote on that. If 80% approve the action, it becomes a binding commitment on 100%, everyone there. So at the time that this initiative process was established, I think we had 45 different utilities that operated nuclear power plants. Obviously, we've had a lot of consolidation over the last 25 or 30 years, and now we have 25 operating companies. So the 80% threshold has changed as the number of companies has reduced to who owns and operates nuclear power plant. But there's another important point I want to make with regard to industry initiatives, and that we do not vote or take these initiatives on behalf of the industry as a substitute for regulation. We do not think that is in the interest of the industry, because it potentially undermines the confidence that the public would have in our regulator. So our position is, if there's a valid regulation that passes through the Nuclear Regulatory Commission's process to become an obligation or a regulatory requirement, then we urge the NRC to take that action. We do not want to take that action voluntarily if it's something that's justified under their system or processes. To do so, we think, again, undermines the purpose of the regulator, which is to provide for public health and safety and security. There are many, many examples of industry initiatives that have been passed over the years, but it's not like there's 100 of these. I'd say there's probably about 20 that the industry has taken since 1988 on behalf of the industry. And I'll give you one example. One of the more recent ones, where we had groundwater leakage at several of our plants from tritium. Tritium is a very ubiquitous substance that occurs in nature, and especially at nuclear power plants. And we had some events where we had leaks of tritium that weren't significant from a public health and safety perspective, but they really undermine public confidence in the integrity of the plants. So as we discussed this with NRC, there really was not a safety case for them to promulgate a new regulation or requirement. The safety basis was not there. But as an industry, we knew that this issue was hurting us because it undermined public confidence. So we as an industry took the initiative, a formal vote by the companies, to do groundwater monitoring, and that was followed up with a buried piping initiative to make sure that the integrity of buried pipes and tanks was very, very good, and that we stopped some of these tritium leaks. We still have some from time to time, but it's greatly reduced as a result of the initiative we took, and I think our public confidence has been restored by that initiative we took. Let's go to the next slide, please. Slide 5. So we've worked with the NRC on many, many issues and continue to do so today. So when I go to the NRC, or some of the people that work for me go to the NRC, we are well known there. We're not an unfamiliar face. And we have credibility on behalf of the regulator because we have worked with them very, very closely over the years to resolve issues. And that's the thing, is that it does no one any good, neither the regulator nor the industry nor the public, for issues to drag on and on and on and not close them out. So we have many successful examples of issues that we have worked on. Some of them are hardware issues, some of them are process issues, how we report to the NRC, And typically, the role that NEI plays is to try to provide guidance for how to meet the regulations. And we also weigh in through public comment, along with other stakeholders, on what the regulations actually are. But perhaps more importantly, we develop the implementation guidance for those regulations on behalf of the utilities. And in that way, we think we know better how to implement the regulations at the sites. And we develop the guidance for review and comment and ultimately endorsement by the regulator as a single way to meet the regulation. And if the licensee follows that guidance, the review of the implementation by the NRC is much smoother. There's a common understanding of how to meet a given issue, and it serves both parties, I think, very, very well. So again, we have credibility through that process. We have long-term individual relationships. I mean, I've known people at the agency. I was at a retirement for one of NRC directors last week that I had known since I started working at NEI. So our relationship goes back over 30 years, and it was difficult for me to see this gentleman leave the agency because he was one of the people that I interacted with a great deal, and he had served 38 years public service at the agency. He had been there since 1976. So again, these kind of long-term relationships, the bonds we established, and oftentimes we disagreed on how an issue should be resolved. But I think even though we may disagree on the way it's on the resolution, there's a common goal to make sure that we get an outcome that's safe, that's cost-effective, and that serves the public. And that's kind of a shared, I think, goal. The difference is, we have the same goal of safety and reliability, but our roles are different. There is an oversight role, and ours is an implementation role. Another thing we learned over the years, and I saw this firsthand in the early 1990s, as an industry, we complained a lot about certain regulations or some of the oversight and inspection processes as either not being safety-focused or being inefficient or diverting our attention, but we didn't provide a better way or an alternative on how to do it better. So it took some hard lessons learned, but finally I think we did learn the lesson, and I think we still to today try to not just complain, that we put a constructive alternative on the table for the NRC to review, for the public to review, other stakeholders. And the best example of this is the reactor oversight process. Prior to 1998, the NRC had what we called a systematic assessment of licensee performance. It was a very qualitative, subjective way to oversee licensees. Its purpose was to determine how many resources NRC would allocate to a given licensee based on their inspection reviews from this process. And we found through tracking the inspection hours and data that there was no correlation between the grades that a licensee would receive in that process and the amount of inspection hours they got from the NRC. So it really wasn't serving the purpose. It also was very non-transparent. It was difficult for the licensees to understand the whole totality of the inspection process. It was very difficult for the public to understand the results of the NRC's review. In fact, these binders, like these binders that you have in front of you here, that was what the commission had in front of them to review the performance of a single licensee. You'd have to go through 3 inches of paper to try to determine and read all that. And there had to be a more objective process put in place that would serve not only communications between the NRC and the licensee, but also provide more objective evidence for the public to see how that licensee was operating. So we put an alternative on the table, and I would say probably 80% of what is now the reactor oversight process was developed by the industry. A lot of the performance indicators we use were directly developed by the industry. The inspection program, that is the NRC's program, but we comment on the different inspection modules. There's a significance determination process that's put in place that uses probabilistic insights to determine the significance of findings that come out of the inspection program. And they're put in place with the performance indicators to determine how much oversight a licensee gets. Across the board, between the commission, the industry, and the public, everyone thinks this is a much better process than what we had before. Everything's transparent. There's an NRC website that captures both all the inspection reports that a licensee receives, as well as tracks all the performance data across about 15 different performance indicators. That's all there for the public to see. So it's been a very successful joint endeavor between the industry and the NRC. And I think that's the best illustration I can give you of how, rather than just complain about the old process, we put our best people together to try to develop something that worked better for everybody. And I think we were successful. The one last bullet I'll talk about here is, and this is the interesting dynamic I was alluding to earlier, was how congressional oversight plays into how the NRC regulates the industry. The NRC is an independent federal agency. The commissioners are appointed by the president. Depending on which party is in power, they get a majority of the three of the five commission slots. But in the Senate, you have an Environment and Public Works Committee that has oversight responsibility for the NRC. And also in the House, there's also oversight through the House Energy and Commerce Committee. Even though the NRC is an independent agency, they pay a great deal of attention to the oversight that they get from Congress. That can either be at hearings. In fact, there's a hearing, it's Thursday here, it'll be Thursday tomorrow. Tomorrow in the U.S., there's a hearing between our commissioners and the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee on the Fukushima response. Now, typically, the subjects at a hearing aren't limited to what the title of the hearing is. They can ask the commissioners anything they want. But we've been able to interact with the Senate, senators and congressmen. We're able to provide some questions for the commission. The commissioners know we do this as an agency and that we talk to senators and congressmen, et cetera. And I'll talk more about our lobbying organization within NEI later. But that is an important piece of what drives our regulator, is the oversight that they get from the Congress. For a long time, back to the 90s, there wasn't an oversight hearing of the NRC for, I think, almost 7 years. They went without an oversight hearing. And as a result of our urging, Senator Inhofe, who at the time chaired the Environment and Public Works Committee, reinstituted regular hearings of the NRC. And that, to us, gives us a little bit more leverage to get our issues. Oh, okay. Sorry about that. That gives us a little bit more attention, if you will, to industry issues with the regulator. So that process continues today. It's a very important piece of, and it's, I think we learned, and that's one of the reasons that NEI was formed, was it brought the technical, regulatory, the political, and the communications and public relations together under one management team. Before that, they were all separate. And it was hard to resolve our issues without addressing every element of that. I often have to tell my friends at the Electric Power Research Institute, or our technical support, that the technical solution alone is not enough to resolve the issue. There are political issues, there are legal issues, there are public confidence issues, and there are technical issues, okay? You need an approach that addresses all of those. Now, some issues are different. Some are half technical, half political. Some are 90% political and 10% technical. So the issues vary, but you still need all those perspectives at the table to put a resolution strategy together for the issue. And that's worked for us very, very well. Okay, let's go to slide 6, please. As I said before, NEI has about 350 members. 25 currently are operating companies of the 100 nuclear energy plants we have in the U.S. Those utilities, those 25 companies, represent about 90% of our budget. So we are heavily driven by the utility perspective at NEI. We also have the reactor vendors, as I said, Westinghouse, GE Hitachi, and Areva participate. They serve both on our board of directors as well as our Nuclear Strategic Issues Advisory Committee, which is the chief nuclear officers of all the companies. The reactor vendors participate in that activity. However, they do not have a vote on the initiatives that I talked about earlier. Those are commitments on behalf of the operating companies, not on behalf of the vendors. And quite frankly, the vendors do not provide a lot of perspective at the meetings on how to resolve issues. I think the value to the vendors of NEI is that they have their customers in the room and they can get a firsthand understanding of the issues that we're trying to deal with, and they can propose back to their customers with information they get from our meetings, solutions to some of the technical issues that help their clients. So we're glad they're there. We really get support from them through the owners groups that the utilities belong to, whether it's a pressurized water reactor or a boiling water reactor. So we leverage those committees at the owners groups. We leverage EPRI. But it's an interesting relationship between sometimes there's certain issues where utilities are on one side and the reactor vendors are on a different side. Hopefully we don't have too many of those. But we do have a separate, we call Supplier Advisory Committee, that works on vendor-specific issues like export controls for nuclear technology and other things. So it's been a good relationship. There's no other real trade association for the vendors to participate in Washington that's nuclear related. So it's been a good, solid relationship within NEI for both the utilities and the vendors. Let's go to slide 7, please. Let me talk a little bit about independence, and I got into that a little bit now. We rely on EPRI for technical support as our first go-to, if you will. They are funded by the same utility companies that are our members. So there's a big overlap in the memberships of not only EPRI and NEI, but also of IMPO. So we go to EPRI to provide that technical support. As a matter of fact, this week in San Francisco, EPRI is having its technical meetings, all of its working groups, task forces, and what they call the Nuclear Power Council, which is kind of the equivalent to our Nuclear Strategic Issues Advisory Committee, chaired by a utility chief nuclear officer. I have one of my vice presidents at that meeting. We work very closely with EPRI on these issues, but we try to make sure that the resources are there in the technical areas we need support on, and that's aligned with some of the issue resolution strategies we have with NRC. So we have to work very closely with EPRI. They're on almost all of our different working groups. They participate in the NSIAC as well as our board. So there's, again, close communication. The same goes for the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations. You know all about IMPO and their formation in 1980 after 3 Mile Island, so I won't go into great depth there. But IMPO also participates in many NEI activities, and we participate in many INPO activities. But INPO is an independent organization set up precisely to be our self-regulator, to go beyond compliance with the regulations, to strive for excellence. They are not a public organization. Little or nothing from INPO is ever made public, okay? That's our job at NEI. We're the public face of the industry, and we speak on behalf of the industry. INPO speaks on behalf of INPO, not of the industry. So that's, I think, an important difference. And that's the way it's designed to be and set up by the utility companies. I talked a little bit about, the vendors and their relationship with the utilities, and really they're there to help support resolution. The rest of the dues from NEI, as I said, 90% are made up by the utility companies and the 3 reactor vendors. The other 10%, I'd say the other 300 odd members, are from the smaller suppliers. We have many universities that are participate. We do not charge the universities. We have many international members, but those membership dues are quite small compared to the utility companies that make up the bulk of our budget. Let me go to slide 8, please. Safety culture has been a key issue in the U.S. for quite some time, but it really came to the forefront after the Davis-Besse event in 2002. And if you recall, that was corrosion in one of the reactor vessel head nozzles that was very, very significant. There was small margin left between significant leak of the reactor coolant system had that gone on. It raised a lot of questions about safety culture, not only at that particular utility, but across the industry. There were, in some of the oversight hearings that the NRC was having, I remember the senator from Ohio being very tough on the NRC in terms of what are you doing to assure the proper safety perspective at the utilities? Is that something you can really regulate, or is that something that the licensees really should be responsible for? Our position was always that we think that that's something that the companies have to do, and that you can't regulate a good safety culture. There are things that the regulator does require, however. One of those is the second bullet, this employee concerns program. And this has been around for a very long time. It started even during periods of construction for the first generation of plants. And that program is a separate program that each company has, where anyone in the company who has a safety concern, first, they are encouraged to go to their immediate supervisor to report that concern. But if they're not comfortable doing that, there's a separate organization within the company that they can take their concern to and have that concern reviewed and acted on without fear of retribution. And that's really what that program is designed to do, without fear of retribution. And when you have these instances or examples where there's suspicion of retribution, perhaps an employee could be terminated or moved to another section or whatever, that gets very high visibility locally in the press with the utility, and brings the legal part of the system into play as well. Some of these get up to even the Department of Justice and Department of Labor disputes at the utility. So this is a very important element of safety culture, is having a good employee concerns program that the employees feel like there's a place to go that's fair, that's objective, and that their concerns get resolved in a timely fashion. So that's an important element. And that contributes to what we call a safety-conscious work environment. That's a subset, though, of the overall safety culture that we want to have at the plants. That starts at the top of the organization, from the chief executive officer all the way down within the organization. Sometimes when we had these discussions with the regulator, people were trying to define safety culture, what it meant to them, and you can have a lot of different interpretations of what that is. Our definition of it was very simple, and that is, are you finding and fixing your own problems, or do you have to rely on the regulator to come in and find your problems? If that's the case, you don't have a very good safety culture. So we put in place an industry initiative that was voted on by all the chief nuclear officers to establish a process within each utility, and we used the corrective action program as the implementing mechanism at the utilities. Each plant has a corrective action program where when you have conditions in the plant that are reported, it goes into this program. Whether it's a maintenance issue, an engineering issue, an operations issue, or any other issue, there's a board of corrective action review board that goes over these conditions, and an action is put in place to resolve the issue. This safety culture initiative was trying to look at potential leading indicators of what might be a safety culture issue through this corrective action program. So we put a guidance document together. We had a lot of help from INPO with that. And we established a separate review within the corrective action program to look at attributes of safety culture. And we went ahead and put that in place. And as I said, we didn't do it in lieu of regulation. We thought it was an important thing to do. It was important politically to do it as well, quite frankly, because of the oversight after the Davis-Besse event. But the NRC did not end up regulating safety culture, but in the inspection program, they do review how we are implementing this initiative. So it does get some regulatory oversight. And I think it's been successful thus far, although we're looking at ways to improve it this year. But again, it got back to the fundamental question. If you're not finding and fixing your own problems, then that's the biggest indication that there's a safety culture issue at your facility. Okay, let's go to slide 9, please. Just a little bit more about NEI. We have about 120 permanent staff positions. That's been very stable since NEI was formed in '94. We still have about 120 permanent staff positions. We take some loaned employees from the utilities and the reactor vendors, and sometimes from the architect engineering firms. Several loaned employees turned into permanent NEI employees through the program. Some go back to their old company, and there's a real value proposition. It's difficult to set. We try to get good people, obviously, from our members, but then they're giving up a good person to send to us. The value proposition that we try to provide is that your person gets to work in Washington in the policy organization, will get exposure to not only the technical regulatory piece, but the government affairs, public relations, policy end of the industry. We'll get a chance to make relationships with the regulator that you wouldn't be able to make at the plant, and bring back that expertise to the utility. So that's been a successful program. It's not as formalized as the loaned employee program that INPO has in place. INPO has many more loaned employees than NEI has. In fact, and it's more of a mandatory requirement for the INPO members. If you don't provide the loaned employee, your dues will go up on a yearly basis, your membership dues. So we don't do that at NEI. It's purely voluntary, but we get a lot of help from the utility companies as well as the vendors. So across NEI, we have professionals from many disciplines. In my division, it's typically engineers and scientists that make up the technical regulatory division in NEI. We also have many people that served in the United States Navy in the Naval Reactors Program. In terms of our public communication staff, we've got about 20 writers and media relations professionals. In terms of our government affairs staff, we've got about 10 registered lobbyists. There's also a smaller policy group that sometimes it's hard to determine the difference between policy and politics, but we have a separate policy group that tries to, really their constituent is the financial community, as well as some of the legislative efforts on used fuel that have been ongoing in the United States for a long time. And then we have a single administrative support division information technology, human resources, et cetera, that is about another 40. So in total, again, we're about 120 people. Let's go to slide 10, please. Let me talk a little bit about our activities on probabilistic risk assessment. We really try to serve a coordinating role with the industry's PRA activities. We've had many working groups devoted to this topic, many different task forces devoted to this topic, and it's an issue that regularly is reviewed with the chief nuclear officers through our Nuclear Strategic Issues Advisory Committee. The participation we get is from EPRI, again, as their technical consultant on PRA, but both the boiling water reactor and pressurized water reactor owners groups also have committees on risk-informed applications, and we have those representatives participate in the NEI activities as well. But NEI's job really is to provide the primary interface with our regulator on PRA activities, whether it's commenting on policy statements or new regulations or the reactor oversight process, the aspects of that use PRA, or on different applications. We are the interface with the agency. I have a separate section, a director of risk assessment on my staff and personnel that solely work on PRA activities. But they get, again, much help from our member companies and the owners groups to support the development of our products. And that's really what the next slide is about, are some of the applications and coordinations. First of all, let me start with probabilistic risk assessment is not a requirement for the current generation of U.S. reactors. There is no regulatory requirement that says you shall have a PRA model at your site. However, that doesn't mean there's no regulatory footprint. Back in the 80s, the NRC issued what we call generic letter requesting each licensee to perform a probabilistic risk assessment, to identify vulnerabilities in the designs, as well as insights that could be used for accident management. Utilities were required to respond to the generic letter, but they didn't have to perform a probabilistic risk assessment as part of their response. Everybody did, as a matter of we thought it was the right thing to do back then. So every licensee has at least a level 1 PRA model. When we started using these models and applying them to the plant and to some regulatory applications, the question of the technical adequacy of the models at each site was a big question, was a big issue. So we developed a peer review process in parallel with the American Nuclear Society and the American Society of Mechanical Engineers developing standards for PRA, that we could do the peer reviews against those standards. And we would take experts from different companies that would go to a single plant to review that licensee's model. And they would develop facts and observations, gaps between the licensee's model and the standard, and it kind of gave that company a roadmap for how to make sure that their PRA was technically correct and usable. And the regulator participated in this process and gave us credit for these peer reviews, such that when it was used for a regulatory application, the question of the adequacy of the model was not in play. It was solely looking at how the PRA insights were going to be used to support a change to the licensing basis of the plant. So we had to address this technical adequacy element, and we did it through peer review. Now another thing, so we put together the peer review guidance. We helped form the peer review teams that went out, and every licensee now has had their level 1 PRA peer reviewed by an industry group. There have been many applications of risk insights in the regulatory process, and these are formal changes to regulations that were in place. And I listed some of the examples here. Probably the biggest success was in the in-service leak rate testing and inspection that used risk insights to reduce the scope of the in-service inspection program to areas that were very risk significant and make, on a less frequent basis, look at other areas that weren't as risk significant. So it helped focus the resources on the right things. On our integrated leak rate testing, this is when we pressure test the containment vessel. We went from having to do that test, which is a plant-wide test that basically adds 3 or 4 days to an outage every other cycle, every 3 or 4 years, depending on what your refueling cycle was. We got that test interval extended to 10 years initially, and now to 15 years to do that. So that was a significant savings on the part of outage time that has helped increase our capacity factors of the U.S. plants. The same with the technical specification, allowed outage times, and the surveillance test intervals. In particular, the allowed outage times in our technical specifications, if you have an issue with a system that you have to remove that system from service, you have a set amount of time to repair that system, or you must shut down the plant. For example, on emergency diesel generators, typically the allowed outage time for a single diesel generator was 72 hours. In some cases, even less than that. Using risk insights, we got the allowed outage time for the diesels extended to 14 days to be able to, and that allowed us to do maintenance while the plant was online. And when you think about it, we really didn't need a lot of probabilistic risk assessment insights, but the main reason was common sense. Many people, before we made this change, much of the maintenance of the diesel generators was done during a plant outage. But think about it, you don't have any steam during a plant outage and nothing to drive some of your turbine-driven pumps to put water in the reactor. That's the time when you really do need the emergency diesel generators if you do have a loss of off-site power. So doing that maintenance online when you had steam was actually a safer condition to perform the maintenance than doing it during an outage. But to do that, we had to extend the allowed outage time for those diesel generators. And we did that using the risk insights. We got that through the regulatory process. That was another factor that allowed us to reduce the overall outage times and get our capacity factors up. So there's many examples, the diesel being maybe the foremost one, of where we looked at equipment outage times, used risk insights, and were able to extend the allowed outage time to something that would allow online maintenance. So we do as much online maintenance as we can to reduce the scope of what needs to be done during an outage at the facilities. It improves the material condition of the plant and also improves the reliability of the equipment. You do take a little bit of a hit on the availability of some equipment, but when you look at it in a probabilistic model that incorporates the reliability and availability times, you can actually get a safety enhancement from that. So that has been a significant, when I started at Newmark in 1989, the average outage duration for our plants was in the 70 to 80 days. By 2000, we'd got that down to the average being about 35 to 40 days, and we've been able to maintain that. And one of the reasons was the risk insights that were used to extend these allowed outage times to enable us to perform online maintenance. And that has held steady. The last one here, the Mitigating Systems Performance Index. This is another one. It's an interesting example because there was resistance from the NRC at the staff level and in this performance indicator. Before this performance indicator was developed, we simply monitored the availability of equipment, safety system unavailability. And there's a relationship between unavailability and reliability. And if you weren't looking at reliability, you could not do the perform maintenance and reduce your unavailable time and look good in the performance indicator, but you set yourself up for potential failures when you tested that equipment.
So we developed this, we call it MSPI, is the acronym for Mitigating Systems Performance Index. Considers both availability and reliability, so that you couldn't simply reduce your availability, because reliability has a much bigger impact on this indicator. It's a complex indicator. It required the use of plant-specific PRAs, but through our interactions with the commission, we got that implemented and a change to the reactor oversight process, and it has led to voluntary improvements at the licensees to increase their margins on this index, because not every system has the same risk significance at one site versus the other, and this allows you to tailor that to a specific plant. So that was a good example of how we use PRA both to improve our performance and also to make the indicator a better indicator, a truer indicator. Okay, let's go to slide 12. I want to talk a little bit about building public confidence. There's a lot that goes into this, but I think that until we as an industry in the United States actually were more transparent about our operations, it was always difficult to have public confidence. And so really, when we helped and provided the constructive alternative with the reactor oversight process, it was a very difficult decision on the part of our membership, the operating companies. They were willing to put their data out on the table in public. And there was always a fear that the public would rank the plants, from 1 to 100, safest to least safe, using that data. And so we had to overcome that as an industry, saying, hey, that's our performance. We're good. We think we're good at it. We think we can show improvement if we do that. And so we started that in the mid-90s, and I think it's been essential to the strong safety record and the public confidence we've been able to have in the United States. So transparency is key. Being responsive, and the example I'll use there is we had the Deepwater Horizon incident in our Gulf, the oil spill, prior to Fukushima. It was in 2010. And I remember watching that platform burning in the Gulf and thinking, if that was at a nuclear power plant, we would be in big trouble, because those images were so searing of the fire from that oil rig. Okay, so we did our own lessons learned on how BP responded to all the scrutiny they got after Deepwater Horizon. And we saw how the other companies, the other big oil companies reacted. And I'll never forget, they were in front of a congressional oversight committee, the CEOs of 5 main oil companies, and it wasn't the BP one, it was the other ones. And all of them said that couldn't happen they basically said that couldn't happen to our oil rigs. Can't happen here. And I thought that's what differentiates our industry, I think, from that, is that, no, we think it can happen. It may not be exactly the same event or the same design, but it doesn't take a lot to think of different circumstances to have the exact same consequences. So we would not point the finger at, the company that had the event. And quite frankly, that's how we've gotten better, I think, in the U.S., is we take that experience, like it did happen at one of our plants, and do an analysis of what programs and practices we have in place to make sure that event can never happen again, or reduce the probability of it happening again. Can never say never. But I think that's how we've improved as an industry, is by taking those lessons learned, even though maybe on the surface it doesn't seem like it's applicable. So we did our own lessons learned on Deepwater Horizon before the Fukushima accident. And when the accident did occur in March of 2011, we were very visible as an industry. I did a lot in the early days with my CEO, and then we brought in many CNOs, many past CNOs, to help us with the flood of requests we got from the media, from the newspapers, television, et cetera, to get out and talk about what was happening, what we do here, and we couldn't obviously tell exactly, minute by minute or even day by day what was happening at the site, but at least provide some context for what was happening in terms of safety. And we, had a group put together. Our website, we went from, on average, we got 100,000, we call them hits, on our website daily, went to 8 million at the peak of the Fukushima accident. So we were the information, first choice for information, and it was factual, it was objective. We had to be very careful about protecting our own credibility. We did many congressional briefings. I did financial community briefings, press briefings, congressional briefings. In the first 2 weeks, we're all trying to keep the different stakeholders engaged and give them objective, factual information about what we knew, as opposed to what happened in the oil industry. So we think we learned some of the lessons and applied them at that time. And I think we got high marks for being transparent, being open, and being responsive when there was an event. We try to communicate as clearly as we can. We try to use language that the public understands. We do message testing on the language we use in the public. Those are focus groups. You see them in political campaigns where the message, they have a dial, how they respond to the message that the politician is saying. If you like it, you turn the dial up. If you don't like it, you turn the dial down. We do a similar thing on how we communicate on nuclear issues, whether it's seismic issues or radiation or groundwater. We actually message test to make sure that we're using language that gets understood and responded to in a favorable fashion. And again, we try to be proactive and not wait to be asked to provide it, but rather get out there in front. And it's also, I think, important, we've established relationships with the national media. I mean, most of NEI's media relations is done with I'll call them the national or policy-driven periodicals, whether it's the New York Times or the Washington Post, the major networks, et cetera. But at a company basis, they do the same thing in their regions with their local papers, with their local TV stations, to make sure that, you're not, when you have the event, it's not the first time you're talking to the public or the media people in that region. So they know you, there's some credibility established, and again, that helps if you do have some kind of crisis or event. We use, going to the next slide, slide 13, many techniques to try to build confidence. We do have a third-party program that generates letters, and we have speakers that give talks at public forums on different issues. We do our own visits to the editorial boards of the major newspapers. We do visits to the financial community. In fact, every February, we have our executive committee meeting in New York City, and I go with our policy director, who's the principal point of contact for the financial community in the U.S. We go to all the ratings agencies to talk about our industry, and our CEO gives kind of a state of the industry address in New York every February to talk about our perspective on how things are going. Social media has been the biggest, I think, change we've seen in trying to get out to the public what's happening. And we're also factoring this into our event response capabilities, because if you're not on top of it, or somebody's going to take a picture who's at the event when it happens, it'll be on the internet before you ever got your press release or your fax out. I mean, I don't think many people even use faxes anymore to communicate with. It has to be real time, and so we're getting better at that. We still do some branding and advertising, but it's very limited. We don't have a big budget for that. We do try to build coalitions across different constituencies. We have our Clean and Safe Energy Coalition, or the CASE Coalition, that has, I think, over 3,000 members now, with the labor unions, the trades, policymakers in the states and local, different organizations that recognize the value and importance of nuclear energy in providing a balanced electricity portfolio. And we also do considerable opinion research and polling. We've had the same woman who's been doing our polling for 30 years. And so we can see the changes in the public response based on that polling. It's the same question that's asked twice a year to 1,000 people across the country. We saw, before the Fukushima event, I think favorability for nuclear energy was around 70%. Very high, almost an all-time high. When that was taken in April of 2011, a month after, that favorability had fallen to 48%. So we lost 25% of the people favorable to nuclear. But by September of that year, it was back up to 68%. So we'd almost recovered fully in the public's eye confidence in nuclear energy. And I think that was due to us being proactive and very transparent during the event and not trying to hide, okay, as the oil companies did. Very important. Okay, slide 14. I looked at the different regulations that this group had identified for case studies, for station blackout, for ATWIS, for 9/11 measures, as well as the ECCS strainer, the issue. And let me start with just a general perspective first. And I said this before when we were talking about our industry initiatives. We do not take these, yeah, I got it, thank you. We do not take these voluntary actions as a replacement for or in lieu of what the regulator should do. And I think you'll see from the summary on ATWIS, on SBO, there were rules that were promulgated by the NRC, 10 CFR 5062 and 10 CFR 5063, to address those specific issues. Now, we wrote some implementation guidance on station blackout and did considerable work, especially on the diesel generator reliability portion of that. But this was not treated as a voluntary issue. This was something that NRC promulgated. We did not fight with the NRC over these regulations. We thought they were justified through their process. They were not justified. There's two different ways to justify NRC requirements. One is called adequate protection, where there's no cost-benefit analysis done. And the other is substantial additional protection, where there has to be a significant improvement in safety in a cost-beneficial way. So for these two regulations, these were both passed as substantial additional protection that was cost justified. So again, we did not argue with the NRC over those regulations. The ECCS strainer issue was very much based on operating experience that you've noted here that started in Sweden. The boiling water reactors were the first to go on that issue, putting in very large suction strainers at each of the plants. That was followed in the PWRs, and quite frankly, we think this issue was resolved probably 6 or 7 years ago. Each PWR significantly increased the size of their strainers and did additional work within the containment, insulation removal, debris blockers, etc. We still have a hard time with our regulator on this particular issue closing it out. And we feel like we're at the very, very tail ends of the probabilistic distribution. But this has been, this to me is a commercial for risk-informed regulation, to using PRA insights, because we think the issue was resolved, yet we're still spending time and resources on a very, very low probability of occurrence that you could actually clog these strainers in a PWR. So, you know, I'm not an expert on what happened here in Japan on these. I can only read what's in your table. But it doesn't look like your regulator acted on any of these in a obligation or new requirement, as opposed to what we did in the States. On the aircraft impact assessment, after 9/11, the first regulatory requirement was in the form of an order to all licensees, power reactor licensees. an order doesn't get public comment, it's an obligation on the part of every licensee to respond to the order. And we try to help implement that order in the most effective way we could. Quite frankly, security has been a big issue in our country because it seems like from the day the airplanes hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, we've been on what we call red alert with security. We've hired another 3,000 security officers. We've made our plants into fortresses. When you visit a plant in the United States, you see lots of barriers and barbed wire and security officers with very heavily armed and very fortified positions. We do actual force-on-force exercises every 3 years that are regulated, overseen by the NRC. There's many more exercises done throughout the year. But we've reached the point, I think, where while the threat is credible, we're such a target-rich environment in the United States because we're an open society where a terrorist may be crazy, but they're not stupid. I mean, if you want to attack a fortress that's heavily armed, heavily barricaded, heavily trained, when you can go to another area that doesn't have any protection, where would you go? Okay, so we think we've got a deterrent established that's very credible, yet we continue to spend a lot of resources on security and maybe, and this is not a place where risk insights have been used at all. And we're still trying to figure out maybe how to bring risk insights into this equation. The NRC has formed a whole new office just to look at security issues that wasn't there before 9/11. And, you know, they keep coming to work every day wanting to improve security, and we have to respond. So it's been a difficult issue for us, but a necessary one. We wish we could get it a little bit more cost-effective. I think that was the last slide I had. Again, in these cases, it was more about the industry trying to provide implementing guidance that met the rule and not argue about whether the rule was needed or not. So let me stop there. I've talked enough. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
はい、ありがとうございました。